Thank you very much, and grateful for that introduction. Also, we're most grateful for Carnegie Mellon University. Not only is it a spectacular place, but my daughter-in-law is professor there now, and she teaches Russian literature, but also is doing computer mapping of Tolstoy's international linkages globally in the true spirit of Carnegie Mellon. It's a wonderful university, and I'm deeply grateful to you also for the introduction. I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially to Boris Mints for this wonderful institute and the tremendous honor of receiving an award from the institute. And I have to say, when I see people standing in a room like this, I just have to give you a fair warning. 45 years ago, I was in a packed room, standing room only, and I turned to the person next to me and began chatting. We got married 37 years ago, Sonia, and so be careful who you talk to. But do say hello. You could meet someone very interesting, and it's a good way to get to know each other. This is also a little bit for me, just coming in a little bit like that TV show, which the older generations will know, This Is Your Life. Because in front of my eyes, past several decades of great friendship and interaction, Lazaro Tates and Manuel Trachtenberg, whom you all know, we were roommates 40 years ago. It was actually 39 years ago in Givat Safrakim while I was visiting Hebrew University, and established a 40-year deep friendship and mutual admiration society. I don't know if it's mutual, but it's at least my way, admiration society for both of them. And many, many friends, people that I admire enormously, Boris Mints and Sergei Babinin from the first days of Russia's reforms, going back a quarter century, where I had a great honor to work with Yegor Gaidar in the first days of the reform, and with these esteemed gentlemen, and that has been very meaningful. To Ehud Shapiro, who's here, he's been educating me in e-democracy, and we've been talking about ways for information technology to change the world, and I'm going to say a few words about that in my talk as well. And many, many friends and colleagues. I'm just thrilled to be here. And I'm especially excited about the new institute and love the grand vision of it. Strategic policy solutions to global challenges. Perfect. And my whole theme is it can be done. It's not too much different trying to solve a great global challenge versus a local challenge. They both are about the same fixed costs, I find. So you might as well go after the big global challenges. They require the same kind of brainstorming and solutions. There can be scale challenges, but the scale can also work to the advantage, not only the disadvantage. And strategy is absolutely essential to understand the problem in a deep way, to be able to find the strategic input into it. And I'm going to talk about one part of the global challenge. It's not a tiny part, but a part, and that is sustainable development. That's a piece of our global challenges right now. I'll define what it means in a way that the world has already defined it, because this is a concept that is central to global diplomacy. And then I want to describe several of the specific sustainable development challenges. I want to argue that they are all solvable, that we had better solve them, in fact, that since no one else is solving them, why doesn't the Boris Mints Institute solve them in your spare time? I'll do whatever I can to work together with you to help to do this. It's exciting and it's an important opportunity that we have right now. So sustainable development is both a phrase, a little bit boring for a lot of people, a little bit of a puzzle, but it is also a term of art. It's been part of our global diplomatic discourse going back now 25 years to the Rio Earth Summit, where the term sustainable development was first adopted as a diplomatic centerpiece for global cooperation. And it goes back 30 years this year to the Brundtland Commission, which was headed by Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, then Prime Minister of Norway, who introduced sustainable development as a kind of intergenerational concept, meeting the needs of the current generation in the way that future generations can meet their needs. In other words, don't wreck the planet before the next generation gets to it. Between then and now, there has been a change of definition, making it more operational. Now, I would say sustainable development is usually summarized as the triple bottom line: economic, social, and environmental objectives. It's the idea that we have at least a three-objective function that we're trying to meet or optimize to meet economic goals, social goals, whether it's about adequate access or equality of opportunity or gender equality and so forth, social justice objectives. And the third component is the environmental component that was a kind of centerpiece already of the Brundtland Report 30 years ago and the Rio Earth Summit 25 years ago. Bottom line, we're not doing a very good job of the triple bottom line. We're not doing a bad job at the first of the three. Market economics is actually pretty powerful. And while there are ups and downs of a market economy, and it's not completely self-regulating by any means, and we have bumps in the road and accidents like the 2008 financial crisis, you have to be pretty impressed at how the world economy functions. There's 7.5 billion people in the world, and yet with that very crowded world that is 5 times more crowded than it was a century ago, the world output per person is averaging $17,000 per person right now. That's measured at what we call international prices or purchasing power prices. We have $127 trillion of world output, and the world economy continues to grow at nearly 4% a year. So I don't think the economic side is really doing too badly. It's actually a remarkably powerful engine. But the other two legs of sustainable development are not automatic in any way. The first thing you learn in textbook economics is that a market economy, assuming several conditions, does something to maximize output appropriately defined, but it doesn't do much to ensure the distribution of income. And an efficient market economy, by definition of efficiency, getting the most per unit of input, can lead people to starve to death, can lead people to die of poverty. And our rich world market economy does that. Millions and millions of people die every year because they're too poor to stay alive. And I'll say a few words about that. It's a kind of shocking anachronism now. How can you have $17,000 on average per person and having people die of poverty by the millions? It's a little bizarre in my view. And it's sufficiently bizarre that I spend most of my time thinking about how bizarre it is and how we ought to do something to alleviate it, because it's not so hard when we're so rich to not have people die of poverty. But that's the second dimension of sustainable development, is basic social justice. And there's nothing in a market economy that provides basic social justice. That's to be remembered. Then we're absolutely, so far, unable to get a handle on the third dimension of sustainable development, the environmental dimension. And here, too, a market economy doesn't work unless the so-called externalities of the market, putting your garbage into someone else's air or water, are internalized in some way. This is also absolutely basic economics. Not as basic as Chamber of Commerce economics, which stops at the first page and says how great a market economy is, but if you make it all the way through the first year of economics, you hear a lot about externalities, and you know that a market economy will not address things that are not properly priced. And so a market economy only works well when social and private costs, social and private benefits are aligned. That can happen under certain rigorous conditions that the great Kenneth Arrow did probably more than anybody else to establish. I mentioned his name. He was my teacher and just passed away, and was one of the great geniuses of our age. But I remember hearing about the Arrow de Breu economy from him 44 years ago, studying microeconomics, and he made the welfare theorems of modern economics, but then explained to the students right away, don't believe this as something to be taken for granted. This is a benchmark, but it's not meant to be an empirical benchmark. It's meant to be an idealized benchmark, and to understand how you move between reality towards the benchmark. Well, by the time you reach 7.5 billion people and $17,000 output per person, you're having a pretty big impact on the planet. So the weight of human activity on the physical planet is phenomenal, beyond imagination, beyond anything we could have dreamt 50 or 100 years ago. And we have not handled that problem for many reasons, partly a lack of scientific knowledge, partly a lack of imagination, because we're doing things that are unimaginable in scale, and our minds psychologically are not geared towards scale appropriately, and because of political economy. There are vested interests that don't want externalities internalized. Some of the most powerful vested interests in the world are externality generators at their core. And so this means that it's not so easy to close the loop, close the waste cycle, or make a transformation from, say, fossil fuels to low carbon energy, which is absolutely essential for our survival as a planet going forward. So this too is, all right, good. Okay, so this too is a big problem. So in a nutshell, what happened? What happened is that in 1992, the world adopted sustainable development as a concept, not very clearly defined, but pretty nicely motivated. The world adopted 3 big treaties in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, which was a central focus of discussions of the Mints Institute in Malta recently. And I'm grateful for that, because no one mentions that treaty, by the way, even though the drylands is a pretty important and a very unstable part of the world. So these treaties were adopted, and what did they produce? Well, I always thought correct what Nature magazine wrote about these 3 treaties in the week that the governments held a 20th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit in Rio in June 2012. Nature made a very nice summary of the treaties and gave them 3 Fs. Not for fantastic, but for complete failures of implementation, because not one of these 3 treaties has done anything yet. And they're good treaties. I teach them every year. We study them, we read them, they're very nicely drafted, they say all the important things, but they're not self-implementing, they're not self-organizing, and they're not getting done. So 5 years ago, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit, the government said we should do something again. And they did something clever. The government of Colombia recommended, why don't we adopt clear goals that the public could understand so it would know what sustainable development means. And those became the Sustainable Development Goals, these SDGs. Now, it was 3 years of negotiation, which says something, by the way. The government's actually worked at it, which is not normally the case for a lot of things. And I was very much involved in the UN General Assembly. The list of proposed goals started at 300. I was recommending what I always called the Moses precedent, 10. I said, get them on 2 tablets, and then we'll know what to do. We ended up with 3.5 tablets. Couldn't get them down below 17. But here is what the government's produced. And they're not bad. They're actually sensible, which is also not usual. 193 governments unanimously adopting the ideas of ending poverty, ending hunger, universal access to health care, universal access to education, gender equality, universal access to safe water and sanitation, universal access to modern energy services, decent jobs for all, decent infrastructure for all, reduced inequality of income and wealth, sustainable cities, closing the waste cycle, stopping global warming, protecting marine ecosystems, protecting terrestrial ecosystems, peaceful and inclusive societies, and global partnership to accomplish the first 16. So that's it. Not bad. It's a good list. Let's do it. All right? Okay, good. What's the problem? The problem is we got a mess. And one part of the mess to think about is the environmental mess. And that, again, is simply the side effect of a $127 trillion economy. Almost nobody is going down to chop down trees because they like chopping down trees. Almost nobody's pouring waste into the oceans because they like that. Almost nobody is trying to wreck the climate. It's all side effects of good things. And when it's side effects of good things, it's not so easy to stop, because we like the good things, and because the people producing the good things are usually, by the time you reach $127 trillion, pretty powerful. So take fossil fuels. In my history lectures, I sing the paeans of praise to James Watt, who made the steam engine. The single most important invention of the last 10,000 years in my mind. It changed everything about the world economy. It made the modern economy possible. Coal was phenomenally important. It made it possible to break out of what's called the organic economy, which was the economy of poverty. It's so important, we ought to put it on a pedestal and say, thank you, coal, you can retire. Because it was discovered around 1870 that coal, when combusted, turned into CO2, had the property that it absorbs electromagnetic radiation in the infrared spectrum. That's bad, because Earth radiates its heat in the infrared. And so anything in the atmosphere that absorbs radiation in the infrared traps heat. And so CO2 was already recognized by Kendall and many others. Joseph Fourier suspected it, and then Svante Arrhenius wrote about it first in 1896 quantitatively, that CO2 would warm the planet. Kendall. And they were right. And interestingly, Svante Arrhenius, who was one of the great geniuses of modern science, a Swedish Nobel laureate chemist, by paper and pencil without any climate model at all, pencil and paper, calculated with tremendous insight the climate sensitivity to a doubling of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And he said it would be something like 3 to 5 degrees C from a CO2 doubling. And then he got one thing really wrong, which is he said, we're doing that, coal burning is raising the concentration, but it will take 750 years. And he couldn't imagine China. He couldn't imagine what would happen to the global economy, to population, which when he wrote in 1896 was about 1.5 billion, a little bit less probably, about 1.5 billion. And now 7.5 billion people, and China fully growing, increased by more than 30 times since 1978 in economic scale, completely coal dependent. And so now we're really wrecking the climate full speed ahead. And this is basically true across the environmental areas. The ecologists proposed back in 2009 in a wonderful paper in Nature magazine the concept of planetary boundaries. And I find this very helpful. They went around the bullseye, or went around the clock, the doomsday clock, and they identified the major areas where human activity is trespassing safe physical boundaries, where nature is not any more able to dissipate human effects. These include climate change from greenhouse gas emissions, ocean acidification, which, by the way, even if CO2 had no effect on climate, it would wreck the marine ecosystems by acidifying the oceans. And we've already had a 30% increased acidity, proton concentration of the oceans, just by the CO2 dissolving in the surface waters of the oceans. That's destroying corals, and it's destroying a lot of the marine ecosystems, because carbonic acid makes it impossible for any species with exoskeletons to build their shells. So all of the mollusks family and many others, including phytoplankton that are crucial for the food chain, are getting eaten up by acid. They're bathing in acid now. So this is a second dimension. Then food production, which is one of the big concerns of the Mints Institute. Sustainable food production is profoundly problematic for two reasons. One is that the food sector is actually perhaps the #1 anthropogenic sector driving environmental loss, because agriculture uses more water, more land, threatens more biodiversity, puts up more greenhouse gases than any other sector of society. Not surprising, 7.5 billion people want to eat every day. And so that's taking up half of the primary net production on the planet now. We're just claiming half of the Earth's photosynthesis for ourselves. And that's not good for the rest of the species. So we're literally eating our way out of house and home, and eating our way out of all the other species' homes. And that means that water supply, nitrogen and phosphorus flux, which comes from the 100 million metric tons of fertilizer that are put on the crops every year. Invasive species, deforestation, chemical pollutants, like the pesticides and so forth. are all huge problems, all violating planetary boundaries. So the goal is to run a modern world economy to enable today's poor people to have the same benefits that we really love. I can tell you there's nothing better than electricity. And when you work in places that don't have it, you really miss it. And they miss it because their kids die, and they can't refrigerate food, and they can't make the pumps work, and they can't run the hospitals and the clinics, and they can't maintain the cold chains, and yet there are 1.5 billion people without reliable electricity. So we need more electricity. But the basic point is you can't do this the way we're doing it right now. Because if we just multiply up what we're doing, we face disaster. And one way to think about that is that roughly the average income of the developing world right now is something like $11,000. And the average income of the rich world is something like $40,000, $45,000. So if every part of the world was to converge at the living standards we like, that would be a 4-time increase of world output. And then consider that population is going to rise at least 30% more before it peaks and starts to decline if we're lucky enough to bring that about. And we're talking about a 5-fold increase on a planet that's not sustainable with what we're doing right now. So the answer is either we change the way we do things, or we're not able to have a fair world. And my view is we need to change the way we're doing things so that we can have the prosperity, we can enjoy the technology, we can help those that don't have it get it, and we can do it in an environmentally sustainable way. Now, one more point that I want to stress is we're not alone in this quest. And it's not the Western world, it's not the U.S.-led world, that's passé. The U.S. led the world for a half century in the second half of the 20th century. That's over now. We're in a multipolar world. I was in Beijing 4 days ago as part of a summit that President Xi Jinping called for. Dozens of world leaders, they all showed up. Nobody comes to Washington anymore. Nobody. A very weird place. I won't go into it unless someone wants to. Some people go from Washington other places, I think here, and other places in the coming days. But it's really a weird place. But lots of people go to Beijing. And this is a change of the world. And so we need a different concept of cooperation. We have to understand the way the world is changing and the way we're going to have to cooperate as well. China is now the world's largest economy, and I would say it's the world leader in soft power as well right now, because the U.S. voluntarily gave that up recently. We don't want to even traffic in soft power. We just want to be nasty, and America first. It doesn't play very well in the rest of the world. The U.S. is 4.4% of the world's population. I don't think you should be nasty to the other 95.6%. Also on ethical grounds, but just, common sense grounds. Be nice. It's a good strategy. Anyway, this is also part of what global cooperation means. Now, can we make these breakthroughs? The answer is yes, because we are living in the midst of the biggest scientific technological revolution ever. Directing that technology to problem solving is not straightforward. Most of the problems that I'm talking about are not self-organized solutions. If they were, we would have solved them already. The market is really good at solving things that are subject to market solutions. And technology follows the market to an important extent. And so technology doesn't necessarily follow the problem solving in the same way. But we know that the technology is there. And we're in the midst of a revolution. I mentioned, I don't have to mention them in this room, but countless revolutions that are underway right now. And we need to deploy them effectively. There are great strategies for problem solving. I'll mention a few. And we're rich enough to do all of this. So money is not the barrier, or financial means is not the barrier. The barrier is our strategy, our will to cooperate, our ability to focus on things that are important rather than things that are unimportant. So I wanted to quickly mention 6 priorities. And I think that these are all practical, achievable, and fitting topics for this institute. And as I said, after you solve these, there'll be others. So do them as fast as possible without fear of losing a future agenda. So first is ending extreme poverty. Second is stopping global warming. Third is sustainable food security and land use. I'm going to define each of these in a moment. Fourth is redesigning jobs and livelihoods in the age of artificial intelligence. Fifth is promoting long-term well-being. And sixth is reconceiving governance. You may have noticed our government processes don't work very well right now. Our Constitution, which is a lovely piece of work, was written in 1787. Clever, really good. But if you were starting today, you wouldn't write the same Constitution. And so we really need upgrading of governance models as well. And I want to say some words about that. So I'm going to show you the same quick tableau for each of these 6 problems. Define the problem, mention the high strategic solutions, something about the role of technology, something about finance, something about research priorities, and something about partners for the Mints Institute. Because I'm assigning it to Mints Institute. This is not incidental, this is an assignment. That's a privilege of a professor. I get to give homework assignments. So I'm trying to be very practical in this. So let me start with extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is also a term of art. It means formally in the international system, living below the World Bank's poverty line. That's not a great definition, but it's adequate. The world poverty line is $1.90 per person per day of consumption measured at international prices. In 2011 prices. Okay, another definition of extreme poverty is you don't have enough to live to stay alive with reliability day to day. You could go hungry, you could get a bout of dysentery, you could be bitten by a malarious mosquito, you could have a famine. In other words, you're living on the margin of survival. There are something like 1 billion people in this condition of the world's 7.5 billion. The official count right now is about 700 million. I think it's a little too low. That's using the World Bank threshold. But since I define extreme poverty as meaning also you don't have access to health care, maybe your water supply is not clean, and so forth, I would put it roughly at 1 billion. You could even argue up to 1.5 billion. But it's a small fraction of the world. It used to be almost everybody. 200 years ago was 95% of the world. Now it's under 10% of the world. That's great progress. That's the market economy to a large extent. But the 10% is a lot of people, say it's 700 million. A lot of kids are dying every year, almost 6 million a year dying of poverty from easily preventable or treatable health conditions. And we shouldn't let it happen. It's horrible, it's unnecessary, it's an anachronism. It leads also to all sorts of horrible spillovers, to child soldiers and violence and terror and kids without educations and many, many problems that are utterly avoidable. So what's the problem? 700 million in extreme poverty. Roughly 2/3 of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. and 5.9 million deaths of under fives per year. Strategic solution. I would say that the strategic solutions are not hard. They are to direct mainly public investment to health, education, and infrastructure so that today's kids have the skills to combine with a world of private business and capital so that you're out of poverty. It's basically a generational investment problem. The big problem is that poor countries don't quite know how to do it. Their governments are under-strategized, they're under-financed, and you need technology to turn any funding into reliable impacts. The reason that low-cost solutions work is great technology. And so you need a strategy to make this work. What's the role of technology? Everything. But one thing is information and communications technologies make it possible to deliver solutions. A smartphone in a rural village is a godsend. It's the lifeline to the world knowledge community. As long as the app is there, the amazing things that can be done in health and education and infrastructure, remote monitoring, remote sensing, it's all there. Someone just has to go program it. Because no one cares about the village in northern Nigeria or northern Ghana. Or people who care don't have the means to do it. And so we have to make the connection. Strategic financing. Basically, I'm interested in Africa growing the way that China grew. It's not impossible. Africa's growth right now is about 6% per year. It ought to be 10% per year. It ought to be 10% per year, not on the basis of a commodity boom, but on the basis of labor-intensive activities with literate, educated young people. That's not so hard to achieve. And in a world of $127 trillion, it's really within reach. Maybe China will do it by themselves, by the way. The U.S. is completely incoherent right now. And not just with Trump. It's been incoherent for a while, actually. And we're so much engaged in war and so forth, we do nothing in Africa right now, almost at all. And by the way, the last president that actually tried to do something in Africa was George W. Bush Jr., bizarrely enough from my point of view. But he made major investments in health that I helped him to design those programs, and they made a very big payoff. China's the biggest investor in Africa. They see economics, commodities, geopolitics, diplomacy, and so on. I keep saying to Europe, you don't like migration right now? Wait till there are 4 billion Africans, which is the path right now that will happen because the fertility rates are so high because the girls aren't able to stay in school. So we need some strategic financing to get this done. What are the research priorities? Basically, how to deliver high-quality services in low-income settings. My wife Sonia and I have been working on that for many years. It's incredible what you can do for almost no money now in terms of healthcare delivery, in terms of educational improvement, in terms of off-grid electricity, and so forth. But it requires skilled inputs that say, here we are in a place where there's almost no cash and almost no market right now, and there is epidemic X, Y, and Z diseases. What do we do about it? And solving that particular problem. And then the final, what are the partners for Mints on this? I'll mention many, but one thing that I want to mention at the beginning is for Secretary General Antonio Guterres, I direct a worldwide network called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. It's about 500 universities right now that have signed up to promote the global sustainable development goals. That network is like a circulatory system if we put nutrients through it. if we circulate through it, or it's a nervous system that can light up and actually help to solve problems. So if Mints says we've got a great solution, great technology, there's a mechanism for rapid dissemination, uptake, local testing, and so forth, and that's the idea of this kind of approach to reach serious scale. So let me just very quickly run through this problematique of extreme poverty, and very fast, because I want to get to the others. This is a map of where the extreme poverty remains, and you can see sub-Saharan Africa is the main locus of extreme poverty. Quick reality check. Take 700 million people living at, say, half of the global poverty line, that means 95 cents per day, and say, what would it take to bring them up to the poverty line? In other words, how would you close the poverty gap? Well, a quick calculation shows that to do that is 0.2 of 1% of world output. Or if you just focus on the high-income countries, it's a half of 1% of world output. This is the literal sense in which extreme poverty is completely anachronistic. Without breaking a sweat, everybody could live above the poverty line. We wouldn't even notice it, by the way, getting this extra amount. We don't care enough, but it could be done. This is not the best way to do it, transferring cash, but it's just an example of how it could be done, that extreme poverty in a world of wealth is utterly anachronistic. So, how do you approach a problem like this? We've been interested, Sonia and I've been 17 years advisor to the Secretary General of the UN, first with the Millennium Development Goals and now with the Sustainable Development Goals, how to get child mortality rates down. 12 million kids died under the age of 5 in the year 1990. Last year it was 5.9 million. So the all-cause mortality of under 5s dropped by half. That didn't just happen. That was organized public health. How do you do it? It's easy. My solution, I marry a doctor. You have to figure out your own solution. So my solution is we talk about it at breakfast. And you find out there's a list of key diseases which are killing the kids. This is what public health does, the epidemiology. And then you go around, my solution as an economist doesn't really know anything except long division. So what an economist, a good economist, doesn't, at least American economists. Here, lots of people know a lot more. But what we know long division. We know that's not very expensive. We know multiplication by 700 million people. But we don't know anything specific. So the solution is go ask somebody who really knows. That's why universities are wonderful. There's always a colleague who really knows, usually in the next building. And so I went and I asked the AIDS doctors at Harvard, what should we do? They said, treat the people. I said, really? Would that work in sub-Saharan Africa? Yeah. I said, what about nutrition? Don't worry about it. Get the medicines into their mouths. I said, are you sure? Yeah. Okay, so I went to Kofi Annan. I said, I got the solution. Treat the people. He said, yeah, how do we do that? Long division. Kofi, it's cheap. We should have a global fund. Started a global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Now there are 16 million people on treatment from zero in the low-income countries in 2001. And now it's been discovered, just as an example, if you treat everybody that's HIV infected, you also break transmission, because not only do you keep them alive, but their viral load is so suppressed that they're no longer infective to others. So it's what's called treatment as prevention. And now we're on to the idea of getting almost everybody on treatment in order to fully end the epidemic, because the drugs are at such low cost. Okay, take the list of the top child killers. I made the list by 2015. Neonatal complications, neonatal, lower respiratory infection, diarrheal disease, congenital birth defects, malaria, neonatal sepsis, other neonatal disorders. How about having births that are safe? You see, neonatal is half the problem right now. Sonia has set up delivery rooms around low-income settings, trained skilled birth attendants for some added features, and then you get the death rates down remarkably. Malaria, 100% controllable, 100% curable every single case, as long as the medicine gets into the kid within the 24 hours of symptoms. That requires information systems. That requires Uber more than health. Except it's Uber in this case, it's really just a bicycle for a community health worker, because it can all be done at home. It's one prick of the finger now for blood on an antigen strip, and then a coartem blister pack, and the kid is alive. And malaria deaths have come down from their peak in 2004 by 70% now because of getting bed nets and these treatments available. Okay, I'm not going to belabor the point. The solutions are real. I argued for years, get bed nets to kids. No, we have to sell them. Don't sell them, give them. Are you crazy? Give them. The kids are dying. This is what goes for PhD economics, honestly. That's how I spend most of my time, which is the most basic common sense, which is kicked out of our heads, by the way. Oh, people won't value what they don't pay for. Are you kidding? If it keeps them alive, they love it. Nobody likes malaria. Oh, I don't want your bed net, I prefer malaria. I can't afford it. I never heard that in 15 years. So we got 1 billion nets out to people. Malaria deaths came down by 70%. Okay, and I show the peak there in 2004. These data don't go far enough out. But the peak was constructed peak. It was a decision. Okay, we're going to give out bed nets. All of these problems have solutions, is the point that I'm making. Okay, here's the next problem. I'd like someone in this room, preferably an undergrad, but we'll take a master's student to solve it also. Okay? Here's the schooling right now. Kids are getting 6 years of schooling in sub-Saharan Africa. SDG 4 says every child should get through secondary school. Here's what I'll give you. We will get you, whoever's solving this problem, I'll get you 4G in any classroom. But I won't necessarily get you a qualified teacher for the next 10 years. But you can have a screen, you can have 4G, we need curriculum, you have to pay attention to the local language, you have to make the curriculum relevant, we need to develop the capacity for this. That's my solution. Maybe you have a different solution. Maybe it's an army of young people who have got a high school degree and they're going and giving education without being qualified teachers. We need a force multiplier to reach a high level of education in a short period of time. This is a solvable problem. It's mainly an information technology problem in my view. I know if I go to the Teachers College or if I go to Carnegie Mellon, which I have with some of your wonderful graduates, they'll tell me online education isn't everything and it's better to have this. True, but there are no teachers in these areas. So please, let's come up with something that can solve something practically, and then we'll build this out. Interestingly, Liberia has fully outsourced its primary education recently, basically to IT startup companies. They haven't privatized it because it's still public responsibility and public financing, but the delivery is now going to companies. And this is fine. This is really the kind of implementation we need, not privatization, because markets will not educate kids without money. But new delivery systems is absolutely feasible. And one thing I want to stress, Africa's population right now is 1 billion people. It was 179 million in sub-Saharan Africa in 1950. Think about that. From 179 million to a billion in 67 years. That's a lot of growth. More than 5-time increase of population. That's very hard to absorb in stable societies. It's putting tremendous strain on the ecosystems. It's leading to the fastest urbanization without infrastructure the world has ever seen. But there's more to come because the fertility rate is 5.2 in sub-Saharan Africa right now, meaning that there still is a tendency for doubling of the population generation by generation. The UN's medium fertility forecast is that Africa will reach 4 billion people by 2100. My advice to every African leader is don't try that. 4 billion is too much. In an age of global warming, with threatened ecosystems, with basically arid to semi-arid conditions over most of Africa, with a tremendous amount of poverty, with an artificial intelligence revolution ending most low-skilled jobs, don't try that. So we want a voluntary fertility reduction very fast. Sonia helped bring that about in the Millennium Villages by making it possible to have contraception, women's empowerment, and girls in school. We'll publish results soon which show dramatic voluntary drops of fertility rates. Across all cultures, by the way, the imams and the priests bringing the households for contraception. But it will not happen if the kids are not in school. So this is a basic strategic insight. Keep the girls in school. It's not so difficult to imagine how important that is. We're not doing it. Only 20% of girls finish secondary school in sub-Saharan Africa right now. What would it take us to think that's stupid? That's dangerous. That's not sustainable. So we've got to shake ourselves a little bit out of the lethargy and into the problem solving, get the milestones, and get on with the case. Let me take another easier one, stopping global warming. This one's simple. This one's not hard, aside from political economy. So the problem here is that we have to move to a low-carbon energy system. CO2 is the main story. It's not the only story, but it's overwhelmingly the story of global warming. So every country should do one particular thing. Make a roadmap to a low-carbon energy system over the next 30 years. It's not hard. Any class, master's class, can do a wonderful job of that. And should. It's a great homework assignment. How should Israel decarbonize its energy system by 2050? And by the way, Mediterranean natural gas is not decarbonized. So, how do you do it? Do you have the wind? Do you have the sunshine? You have got lots of sunshine here. You have the technology. You got lots of technology here. We basically know how to do this. And the three pillars are energy efficiency, which is obvious, make the problem simpler. Zero carbon energy generation, and that's wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, nuclear, whatever. Carbon capture and reuse, advanced biofuels if you happen to be Brazil. And decarbonizing site use of carbon. Basically, we need electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles or synthetic vehicles, synthetic fuel vehicles through carbon reuse technologies so that our cars are not producing 25% of the greenhouse gases. It's not a mystery. It's not even expensive to do this. It's probably 1% of GDP incremental cost. At a global scale, probably $1 to $1.5 trillion of incremental cost per year to drive the world energy system to decarbonization. So the problem is known, the strategic solutions are basically known, the role of technology is easily identifiable, the strategic financing is not difficult, put on a carbon tax and then use the revenues for all the other public goods that need to be provided in this sphere. The research priorities are basically smart grids and low carbon energy technologies like storage, and plenty of partners I'll get for you. Okay, next. Let me point out that if we continue on the present path, we're all going to be underwater. I'm sure that where we are is in red on this map. This is a NASA map of the places underwater with the 6-meter sea level rise. I know that our flat in New York is underwater. It really annoys me. So, this is a map that's based on an insight, which is a painful insight, which is when the world was less than 1 degree C warmer than now. Less than 1 degree C warmer than now in the Eemian period, 130,000 years ago. The sea level was 6 meters higher than today. Actually, I have to keep remembering, Sonia and I met my guru climate scientist at Oxford a few days ago at breakfast, and he said the latest research is 8 meters higher. And Greenland lost most of its ice sheet during that period. So we're so close to the tipping point of West Antarctica and Greenland, it ain't even a joke. Aside from the famines, the droughts, the floods, the disease patterns, and everything else, we're threatening mass inundation of the coastal areas of the world. So we really have to do this. This is no joke. What's the big problem here? There are two big problems in this, not the lack of solutions. The two big problems are geopolitics and vested interests. So the geopolitics are, Israel would say, oh, are you kidding? Of course we're going to use the gas. This is a godsend for our security. Okay? So that's said all over the world. And the second is, whoever owns that stuff likes it. In the United States, the two biggest private owners of this are David and Charles Koch. You may know them. They own the Republican Party. They bought it cheap. It was on sale, fire sale. Give us anything, we'll sell our souls. And so congressmen are incredibly cheap, by the way. It's stunning. I don't understand it, by the way. But a few $100,000, they'll say anything. They'll be willing to sound so stupid you can't even imagine that they would be willing to face their children. And that's the whole Republican Party, with a stupid in chief. Sorry. But, you know, nobody believes what they're saying. Nobody. It's so cynical, it's unbelievable. Nobody believes this. But they let it go on. We can't let it go on, actually. That's the whole story. This is not a complicated one. It's not even the American people so badly educated don't know the truth, because even that's not true, even though that is true. But about 70% of Americans understand that this is anthropogenic climate change. They want renewable energy. It's not true that it's jobs for the coal miners. There are no coal miners anymore. You know, we have 150 million people in the U.S. employment. There are 20,000 coal miners now. 20,000 out of 150 million. This has nothing to do with jobs. There are hundreds of thousands of jobs putting up solar panels. There are no jobs at mines anymore because machines do all the mining. Mines are completely automated. The trucks are completely autonomous. The mine drilling is completely... Who wants to go down in a mine? So the machines do. No, we haven't told them, don't do that. It's bad for your circuits. And so this is really not a hard problem, except the politics. And even there, we're going to break the politics of this, because the financial markets will not put money into stupid projects anymore. So I'm making a bet everywhere that even though Trump signed the Keystone Pipeline, it will never be built. Because if you're thinking of investing in it, please come talk to me. I got a great bridge to sell you, much better than a pipeline that cannot be used. So I'm going to go on to food, because this is a central issue for this institute. This one is tricky, because when it's energy, there are a few off-the-shelf solutions. But when it's food, you have 10,000 food systems around the world. Every local ecology has its own challenges, its own pests, its own soil types, its own risks of invasive species, its own biodiversity challenges, its own germplasms that need to be developed. So food is really complicated, but it's vital. We need it, and the food sector lacks two critical dimensions that I explained one, but and didn't mention the other. The food system is neither sustainable nor is it resilient. Now, by not being sustainable, I mean it's too destructive of the physical environment. By being unresilient, non-resilient, I mean that it is highly vulnerable to the environmental changes that are coming. Because our food crops have thermal stress limits, they have soil moisture limits, they have biodiversity needs that are all being threatened right now. So our food supplies globally are under tremendous stress. Israel knows more about water management than any other country in the world. That's one of the major stresses that absolutely needs to be overcome. How to recycle, how to target. The drip irrigation here is 60 years old already. But now with targeted fertilizer, absolutely vital. Getting nutrients directly to the roots. It's all about capital, physical capital substituting for natural capital. That's what we need to do. So the problem is food production neither sustainable nor resilient. And by the way, the diets aren't healthy. I'm not going to talk about that. That's a food industry problem. What we do with the food that's grown, even more than what we grow, though they're interrelated. But then how it gets processed in a very unhealthy way. Strategic solutions, integrated land use strategies. What are the land use strategies? What is the mapping of the world's land use? Such a map does not exist at a conceptual level. It's one of my goals to produce such a map through a convergence of several scientific disciplines in a short period of time. I'll explain that in a moment. What is the role of technology? Precision agriculture, drip irrigation, smart fertilizer use, mechanization, biophysical modeling, integrated pest management, all known, tricky, but with phenomenal expertise here. Strategic financing. We need a lot of improvements of agricultural finance, from R&D, supply chains, losses and damages from climate, and so forth. What are the research priorities? I would say community-based technology uptake. Where's Ron? Ron's outside. He doesn't want to listen. What Ron Fishman is doing is exactly asking how can communities use these technologies, soil moisture measurements. We were in Oxford a few days ago. They have an accelerometer that they're putting on pumps so that every time the pump halfway around the world is done, not only do you know that the pump has been used, but they also realize that the amplitude tells you, is it a man, is it a woman, or is it a child that's doing the pumping. They also are measuring the micro vibrations of the pump to assess what's happening to the water table and so forth. So there are tremendous things that can be done, but they need to be implemented locally to test how actually to do this. And I'm looking at Gidon Bromberg here, who's leading the effort for water sustainability in this region. All these issues need to be implemented here in a sensible, fair, decent, sustainable manner. So this is a phenomenal set of issues. We're losing on all fronts. The food industry knows almost nothing about biodiversity, by the way. That's not quite true. I mean, if you're using pollinators, then you're aware of it. But what the food industry is doing to biodiversity is not their department. That's a big problem because we're trying to optimize across multiple constraints, protect biodiversity, manage the aquifers, manage the hydrologic cycle, manage the soil nutrients, prevent the fluxes of nitrogen and phosphorus, give livelihoods for local people, and feed the planet. Multiple constraints. It's a great nonlinear, multidimensional programming problem. It's fascinating. It's ideal for analysis, by the way, because you also have global trade constraints. You don't have to produce everything you consume, and God forbid we should. I wouldn't have my morning coffee every day because the coffee grown in Central Park is just not good enough. So we actually need global supply chains. And that's another constraint to put into this kind of thinking. But this is a map of all the wilderness areas being destroyed just in the last 20 years. And the satellite readings, very sensitive satellite readings, are showing the massive groundwater depletion all over the world. This is the NASA's GRACE satellite, which is the gravitation satellite using very sensitive gravity metrics to assess changes in the groundwater around the world. And the most recent paper, which I clipped this picture from, shows that 13 of the 31 major aquifers in the world are in a rapid rate of decline right now because of over-abstraction of water. And some of the places, breadbaskets of the world, like the Indo-Gangetic plains with tens of millions of bore wells in them, have the fastest falling water tables. Or this is what it looks like with eutrophication. This is a beach near Tianjin in China. This is just eutrophication of the massive overuse of fertilizers. A good Israeli technology, I'm sure, could save China tens of billions of dollars of fertilizer use over the next 25 years because they over-fertilize everything. It's costly, and then it's environmentally hugely destructive at the same time. Okay, let me come to another interesting problem. Jobs and incomes. It's not a problem in my view. There won't be jobs in the future. We'll still talk to each other, but instead of us talking here, my computer will be talking to your computers, and we'll be out at a coffee shop. There will be no barista at the coffee shop, by the way, because all of this will be done by artificial intelligence. So this is another one of the big challenges. It's SDG 8, decent jobs for all. The traditional jobs are disappearing. And they're disappearing fast. Garry Kasparov couldn't believe it when he lost to Deep Blue. When Watson became the World Jeopardy champion, that was considered impossible. Natural language with quips and so forth on Jeopardy. And then AlphaGo beating the European Go champion. And it was phenomenal. This fellow here, who's apparently just incredibly gifted Go champion, was quoted the day before, I'm going to trounce the computer, but it's a good exercise because it will help to advance artificial intelligence. And then the next day said, this is hard, but this is going to be, smashed. Then he lost, and he said, it was really a good game. I'm going to win, but, it's going to be more challenging. And then he lost every game. I think it was every game in a row. And by the end, after about 10 days, the quote was, I was overwhelmingly crushed. And this was in a space of 2 weeks, basically, this insight about what artificial intelligence is capable of doing. And this is from DeepMind, which basically produces machine learning on deep neural networks. And they discovered that Go could be computed on a deep neural network in this way. And after they won this tournament, they anonymously entered a Christmas time round robin of the 50 top Go champions. They beat every one of the top 50 champions in the last Christmas. So this is where we're really after. And from an economist's point of view, I'm interested in this curve. This is the labor share value in the United States. Over the last 75 years or 85 years, we've seen a rapid decline of labor share value recently. And I think that this is technology speaking quite loudly, that the jobs for raw labor don't exist anymore, almost at all. The jobs for people with a high school degree, if they exist, it's at sharply lower income levels. It's good to be a college grad. The machines have been kind to us, but they're going to take our jobs also. My job for sure, because I know in 10 years they'll write better research papers. I cannot keep up with the journals right now. There are probably 10,000 journals I should really look at to know what's going on in areas that I'm interested in. For a machine, that's no problem. For me, 1/1000th of that is a problem. And so I'm sure that we're going to get our research work done by smart, natural language, Watson progenitors or descendants that will be able to do this. So I'm interested economically. When will that happen? How will it happen? What should we do about it? And there are several proposals. Of course, one is skills and training. If you invest enough, the machines can be complements rather than substitutes. But it requires more and more training, not just different training, more and more training, because the machines are really versatile. Now you need at least a college degree, but soon you'll need advanced degrees to keep ahead of the machines. Second and third is intragenerational and intergenerational transfers. All of this is producing income. The real question for the world is, does all that income have to be Larry Page's, Sergey Brin's, Tim Cook's, Bill Gates? That's the way it's going right now. So the amount of income at the top is soaring. The amount of income earned by the working class is falling. And if we just go with market outcomes, it's not a happy outcome. So I've been studying this macroeconomically using approaches and models that were pioneered by another colleague of ours, Yossi Zaira, at Hebrew University, looking at machine labor substitution. And you can follow two paths. Now, one immiserization and the other is benefits for all. This definitely can be Pareto improvement, meaning, in the jargon, that everybody benefits, but not without income redistribution. A fourth area is leisure, which I really like and believe in. And we came, I think, the closest to the Garden of Eden that we've seen a couple of years ago when we were in Rwanda and we went to Virunga National Park to see the gorillas. They're in the Garden of Eden. It's enclosed by farmers toiling around the Garden of Eden, but inside the Garden of Eden, they sit around, they play, they shoo the kids away, they eat a bamboo shoot, they have some sex, they look at the tourists. It's leisure time. Okay? That's really what we get from Genesis, as far as I can see. And then take the apple, and all of a sudden you're toiling 10 hours a day in the fields. And I think that that's probably the history of humankind. So that we were doing the former beforehand, we had residual memory of that as the scribes wrote down Genesis 2,500 years ago. They remembered there was a time we weren't doing backbreaking labor, but it was ancient history. And we're trying to get back to it. And for us, we already are back to it because we call this work. Now, for me, and it may be work for you listening to me, but for me, it's just sheer pleasure. And I had a coffee before, and I'm going to have a coffee afterwards. And to my mind, we're not working anymore, though someone's paying us. I don't want to say it too loud. Don't tell Columbia University. But in any event, I think that's where we're heading. In the United States, probably, certainly under 10%, probably 5% or fewer people. Maybe I'll stick with the safe 10%. Do not do anything. Only 10% do arduous physical work at this point. Less than 1% are farmers. Less than 1% are miners. Very few people are on an assembly line because it's all robots at this point almost. There are people carrying things, but construction sites are increasingly automated as well. And we'll continue in that direction. I think it's what humans really want, by the way. Because when I see the quest for development, and when we work, I spent a couple of hours weeding in Kenya. I could barely stand up again. And the woman that was weeding with me was 70 years old. And she was there all day. I was there to film a documentary about weeding. And she was there weeding. And it's hard work. So I'm all in favor of robotics. I'm all in favor of leisure. But again, it requires a socioeconomic pathway. Because leisure with unemployment and no incomes is not leisure, it's agony. And so all of this is to say this is a third puzzle that needs to be worked out, not an impossible one. Quickly, well-being. The bottom line of economics is not GDP, obviously. The bottom line of economics, of social science, should be what Aristotle talked about 2,300 years ago in the best book ever written about politics, and it was the first book, at least in the Western canon, written about politics, called The Politics, which is the common good and the good life. And that is what we're really after. Now, the wonderful thing about our time is that we understand a lot more about the metrics, the neurophysiology, the sociology, the ethics, the game theory of the good life than we did even 20 years ago, thanks to Dan Kahneman, thanks to Gallup International, thanks to many metrics. We can actually study these issues with tremendous sophistication now. And I manage a happiest countries report once a year called the World Happiness Report, using Gallup International data to look at the question of well-being. I'm happy to say Israel ranks 11th in this year's ranking, ahead of the United States, which on a 3-year moving average ranked 14th. And if you just look at 2016, ranked 23rd in the world. The U.S. is plummeting in happiness, not in income level, but in happiness. So we're really feeling the anxieties of a failing state, of a corrupt politics, and of more right now. And I mention this because I know that this is work of interest to this institute. It really lends itself to serious analytics, to comparative analysis, and to policy analysis. What does it take to make a good outcome? This is a recent finding due to my wife, She remarked a few months ago that our list of happy countries look just like the rankings of coffee consumption per capita across the world, because it turns out that the happiest countries are Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and they're the largest coffee drinkers, actually, per capita. So one thing I did was take our basic model and add coffee cups per day. It turns out it has a t-statistic of 3.2, meaning a significance level besting 0.001 significance. This is the partial regression plot. And I called our favorite epidemiologists, Walt Willett and Mayor Stamfer at Harvard University, who run a study called the Nurses Study, which is 70,000 nurses in longitudinal study. And they have found and published that coffee is highly protective against depression, highly protective against suicide, highly protective against other neurodegenerative diseases. And now I'm engaging them. So shall we go have a cup of coffee? So I'm engaging them in a more serious study. But this is the kind of thing that I think really can be looked at. Finally, the sixth of my areas that I'd like to touch on is governance. It is not a secret, either in Israel or the United States, that our governments do not work well anymore. And they can't keep it a secret, even if they try. Also, there are no secrets anymore. Every day in Washington, we have 10 revelations of the deepest secrets, even Israel's secrets. So this is really a major issue. And I think it is the real topic of political science. Don't study how governments work. They don't. Study normatively how governance can work. There's a big difference, by the way, between government and governance. Governance is how we organize our human activity to meet our ends. Government is a particular institution of the state, defined by Weber as the locus of legitimate violence, although that is only one possible definition of the state. But it is in many ways a failing institution because it can't find its place in this complexity right now. Of course it has a role, but it's only one part of governance. And governance, civil society is governance, not just in the nice sense that we all have our say as intermediary institutions. We actually have specific, necessary assignments of responsibility now. Of course, no one's giving the assignment, but I'm suggesting we take the assignment. And I'll be specific. If the Mints Institute didn't exist, I would beg Boris Mints to make it, because we need this kind of institution. Because this is a job for universities now. Governments cannot do what universities can do in terms of advanced, complex, interdisciplinary systems thinking. It's not even their job. Thinking is not part of the assignment. At best, you want decent, adequate, semi-honest implementation. That's about the most we can expect. I don't go to the government and say, what should we do? Are you kidding? And the ministers that I meet all over the world are saying to me, what should we do? And if I say something as general as we should fight global warming, they'll turn their back. That's not interesting. They know that. When they say, what should we do, they mean literally, what do I do? I don't understand this issue. What should I do? And they want specifics. And I want to give them specifics. And I want to make them do the specifics. That's a little harder. But I think it's important for us to understand that our real governance right now is an assigned role. I've worked with governments now for 30 years. I even like a few of them. I respect some of them. I deal with almost all of them. Because they're there. They have things that they have to do. We can't do without the governments. I deal with from authoritarian governments to democratic governments, short-sighted to other. Of course, the more corrupt, the harder it is to deal with. They just don't even want to talk about these issues. But generally, above a minimum threshold, there's an interest in doing things. But I know almost no governments in the world, almost none, that know what to do. And even a government as sophisticated as the U.S. government, we had a Nobel laureate as Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu. I don't need to tell Stephen Chu anything about energy. I couldn't, of course. But he wasn't allowed to do anything because they lived in dread in the White House that Stephen Chu would say an honest line. Of course, he would never say a dishonest line, so he said nothing for 4 years. Because when he did say one thing honest, it made headlines that the Caribbean nations were in trouble from climate change. Well, the White House didn't want to hear that on a trip for the OAS or whatever it was. So the politicians, we shouldn't lose our time bemoaning the politicians. But what we should be doing is helping to solve social problems by defining the pathways. That's my favorite word these days. What's the real path of getting something done? Because this is like finding a dynamic trajectory in a dynamic, multidimensional search process. So one thing I like this guy a lot. He's my hero in politics. President Kennedy had one great idea about governance, which was set big, bold goals. And that, I really do believe, is necessary. Because if we're going to guide solutions, we have to have a shared understanding of where we're going. And this is a particular speech in May 1961 when he said these famous words, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish." And I love that last sentence, because no politician would say that now. But Kennedy went on for 4 paragraphs in this speech saying it's hard. This is going to require massive effort. Don't do it unless you mean it. No use going halfway to the moon. If you're going to do it, do it. And by saying this repeatedly, Congress stood up in a mass cheer and said, we'll go to the moon. And it's amazing, by the way, that it took just 8 years to accomplish this. Because he also set the goal and the timeline. And NASA had no idea how to do it. They didn't have one computer at Cape Canaveral. In Alan Shepard's launch, which was just after Diane's launch, they had a map and a little plastic rocket on a wire that was being pulled along with the stick to know where the ship was as it made its suborbital landing. So he created an enterprise that had 500,000 workers, 0.5% of GDP, 20,000 companies, and got to the moon and back in 8 years. Don't tell me we can't do all those other things. It's ridiculous if we want to put our effort to it. So I always say that sustainable development is our moonshot. And this is what I worry about governance. You probably know the marshmallow test. You know, give the 4-year-old a marshmallow and say, you can eat it, but I'm going to leave the room. I'm going to come back in a few minutes. If it's still there, you can have 2 marshmallows. And Walter Mischel, my colleague at Columbia University, discovered 15 years later that was the best predictor of adult success of these 4 and 5-year-olds, whether they could delay gratification for a few minutes to get the second marshmallow. And this is where we are today. This was, you can eat 1 marshmallow right now, or if you wait 15 minutes, I'll give you 2 marshmallows and swear you in as President of the United States. So we actually are facing our marshmallow test, which is whether we can do a little bit of delayed gratification to get to where we need to go. Now, I'm showing you the One Belt, One Road project of China. They delay gratification right now. China is the locus of long-term investment in the world. Their saving rates are above 40% of GDP. They're investing hundreds of billions of dollars in long-term development. They think long-term. President Xi gave a wonderful speech in Beijing this weekend when I was at the conference with the Secretary General Guterres. The speech had 1,000 years of history. He quoted Ibn Battuta. He quoted Leibniz, or cited. This was a vision. I dared to think of my politicians even stumbling through the words, much less giving the speech. And this is what we need, is this kind of long-term investment. And we need global long-term learning. So goal orientation, dynamic planning under uncertainty, multidimensional systems thinking, directed technological change, multi-stakeholder participation in an ongoing learning cycle. And I did want to mention one more point, role of technology, because this is where Udi Shapiro at Weizmann is working so much, on using online decision-making tools also. So, okay, in 1789, we didn't know how to have everyone participate. We decided we'd send congressmen to a Congress. I don't believe in it anymore. They don't represent me. They spend all their time dialing for dollars. They're all captured by special interests. The American public wants mostly the right things, but our Congress produces mostly the wrong things. They hate the public hates the health care bill that was just voted in the House of Representatives, hates it, including in Trump's party. It doesn't matter. They're so corrupt that they don't care what the public thinks. And so we need a different kind of representation right now. And this is also a job for information technology. This is a job for new forms of governance and institutions. So, to conclude, I'm emphasizing the role of universities. If the Mints Institute wants to do all of this by itself, okay. There are still other problems to do. If you want to work with others, I'll give you some names. But in truth, I think that this is a phenomenal agenda. Israel's a phenomenal, unique place to work on this agenda. It requires global scale cooperation. I think it's phenomenal for this country to be engaged globally in this kind of problem solving. You have the technology, the know-how, the will to do this, the institutional base to do this. And I believe that there is a multiplicity of agendas here. Just to lay them out very quickly, obviously education for sustainable development, the teaching curriculum that is, policy analytics, research development, and demonstration. So we need RD&D adding to fusion, but the university does research, development, and demonstration, getting the technologies out in the field, incubation of new business in the startup nation, the nation of startups, and the convening of sustainable development stakeholders. So I suggest, and I'll leave some slides behind, areas for policy leadership. I, of course, mentioned them. Cases for research and development from agriculture, water conservation, telemedicine, rapid diagnostics, off-grid renewable energy, online education, local language, natural language learning, and so forth. In the UN group that I lead, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, we're producing lots of global free online education materials. And this is a public service worldwide. You teach to the world. Make it available for free. Students anywhere can learn. You have hundreds of thousands or millions of students that way, and I think it's a wonderful way to contribute. Convening stakeholders. We're doing this in Africa. You have just recently done this in Malta around these critical issues. I'm running a conference on low-emission solutions at each of the top meetings. This one will be in Bonn in November, and I'd love to get together with the Mints Institute on this. We have an annual conference once a year at the UN on sustainable development in September. And Udi and his wife Revital will also be performing at concert at Carnegie Hall that evening of this concert, of this conference. And so this will be September 18 to 20, 2017. This is the name of our network. This is a map of the participants. Let me conclude by, again, thanking you for making this possible. Thank you deeply for the award, and thanking all of you for being partners in this.